Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Next up is my conversation with poet, writer, photographer, filmmaker, and musician Dao Strom about her latest bilingual poetry collection of image text from the Hanoi-based Ajar Press entitled You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else. If you are a subscriber to the bonus archive, in addition to my conversation with Dao Strom, I will be uploading a discussion of her music and a live performance of one of her songs, and also a conversation with Ly Thuy Nguyen, her translator, about the experience of creating the Vietnamese portion of the book. This is all up at the Patreon page, where you can also discover other possible gifts for supporting the show as well. You can find all of this at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Nateman, your host. Today's guest is poet, writer, musician, filmmaker, and photographer Dao Strom, a recipient of an NEA Fellowship in Literature, a Creative Capital Award, the Nelson Algren Award, and the James Michener Paul Engel Fellowship, among others. Strom is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She's the author of the novel Grass Roof, Tin Roof, the story collection The Gentle Order of Girls and Boys, and the hybrid form experimental memoir We Were Meant to Be a Gentle People and its accompanying album East West. Poet Bao Phi calls We Were Meant to Be a Gentle People an astounding work of fracture and reconciliation, filled with provocative images, sharp juxtapositions, and eloquent prose. This poetic memoir challenges our assumptions about aesthetic form and preconceived, racialized, gendered notions of Vietnamese refugees in America. So many of Strom's lines and lyrics and pictures are already blazing through my head like lost stars searching for a sky. In addition to being a writer and artist, Dao Strom has become one of the most important and visionary figures in the Portland literary community. She's the co-founder of D-Canon, a visibility project, part reading series, part library, part creator of community space, and part web resource. D-Canon is a forum for and a showcase of writers and artists of color in Portland, Oregon. Strom is also the co-founder of She Who Has No Masters, a collective of women writers and artists of the Vietnamese diaspora, formed around the desire to redefine notions of the Vietnamese feminine as touched by war, history, heritage, mythology, displacement, exodus, violence, migration, and personal experience. She Who Has No Masters has performed collaboratively and written and published trilingual polyvocal collaborative poems. As of 2018, Dao Strom also took over the editorship of Diacritics, the blog of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network founded by the writer Viet Thanh Nguyen. Dao Strom is here today to talk about her latest book, a bilingual poetry collection of image text called You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else, out from the Hanoi-based Ajar Press and translated into Vietnamese by Ly Thuy Nguyen. Poet and writer Khi Nao says, as you enter the pages of You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else, you will discover, as I have discovered, that the slow, seductive music of her polychromatic creativity and her diverse artistic longing are arranged with the C's in mind. C of unity, C of separation, C of disruption, C of departure, C of not here, sea of space and more space, sea of white pages and sea of cannot, sea of silence, sea of insulation, sea of insinuation, sea of nonfiction, sea of history, sea of loneliness, and sea of solitude. You will notice the dexterity of her art, how she is willing to use everything: poetry, art, memories, travelogue, photography, image art, piano, bells, harmonies, acoustic and electric cities of words, to create a language that is geographically symmetrical to her heart and tongue, and where the mind can memorize but cannot pinpoint or pigeonhole. Her beautiful work from a jar moves like a decapod, organic, and it flows. Or, after you depart from the cinema of her sea, you may ask what or who she is, and why is she able to dismantle my soul so easily? With a few gestures of her aching voice, aching image, aching language, aching structure of irrepressible beauty, and the breathtaking landscape of distilled despair. And how is she able to make desolation so compellingly hospitable? What is her secret? Welcome to Between the Covers, Dao Strom.
Thank you.
Quite an introduction from Khi Nao.
Yeah, that's testament to Khi Nao's wonderful facility with language. I'm more than flattered.
So at the beginning of You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else, we encounter a Chinese hexagram from the I Ching, a hexagram that recurs throughout this book and also your memoir, your previous book. And what's interesting about the way it occurs here, because I feel like it occurs with different functions at different times, is that we have these 6 lines, 3 broken and 3 unbroken. But the lines are pieces of a photograph, and those pieces of a photograph are pieces of a photograph of you. And so in one sense, we can look at these broken and unbroken lines as fragments that make a whole. They make this hexagram, and they also sort of suggest a wholeness to you. But on the other hand, we have the breaks in the lines, the white space that don't allow us to see your face. So we have this sort of double sensation, or I did, of something either being irretrievable or something having been erased that was once there. And so I was hoping we could start with your attraction to this hexagram, The Wanderer, and then also maybe just about fragments in relationship to wholeness, and something that I feel like you're circling in a lot of this book and the previous one.
I play around with the I Ching just as a tool, and also just for fun, and that one attracted me because of it being about the etiquette of the traveler, which is essentially like it counsels, the person to be mindful of their surroundings, also to be humble. It's about like being humble and always being aware that you don't know the customs of the place that you're in, and that success comes through this like smallness of being, I guess I think of it as like traveling lightly in the world. And I think I just like that concept as like, something to pay attention to, or just, to keep in mind. So for whatever reason, I can't even remember when I started playing with that shape in a particular way. I don't remember why I started doing that. So, but I used it in the memoir, and I arranged text within that shape, which just played with the shape of the text on the page, and then that naturally, I guess, evolved into splitting up the photos. So fragmentation is, I don't, again, it's like it's hard for me to remember exactly why, but I guess it comes from being on the computer and cropping things and like resizing things, and then, zooming in on something and thinking this was interesting, just, as this small piece of something. So that might be part of where that started.
But it also, there's this feeling, so one of the things it says in the I Ching is strange lands and separation are the wanderer's lot. And it feels like you're collecting and assembling fragments of yourself, like this photograph in both of these last two projects.
I mean, I guess that's kind of like something that I identify with just inside myself, this concept of being fragmented and of many places and many confluences. And photographs play such a big part in, like, I guess, an American Vietnamese person's understanding of Vietnam or perception of Vietnam, and then probably in like American non-Vietnamese Americans also, so much of like I grew up Vietnamese, and then this background of the Vietnam War, like my entry into it was really through documentary photographs or just these images that are famous and iconic about the Vietnam War. So I guess part of me has like come to this understanding or belief that like, it's sort of necessary as a Vietnamese like artist to kind of contend with those images. There's a lot of things I could say, but I guess fragmenting is one way of like taking apart the images and disempowering them or just messing with them, and then the self. I don't know. There's probably more I could say about like evasiveness, but there is something about there's an evasive quality that was like throughout this, like working on this memoir and just everything that I have tried to do in writing about Vietnam or writing about the past has had this quality of like wrestling with very evasive forces or something. Even just getting the date for this interview, like pinpointed for instance, like just there's a lot of like, there's something about that definitely went into like the work that I've been doing, which is maybe why it's become multifaceted also. But yeah.
Well, it's interesting when you say fragmenting something in order to take the power away, because there's a way in which with this sort of work, I think that you can have contradictory interpretations at the same time, like what I was suggesting, the possibility that you're trying to assemble a whole, but you don't have all the pieces. Yeah. So there are these gaps, which can exist at the same time as you've intentionally broken the whole and left the gaps there as a form of taking power. Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe there's a power in like, I don't know, not being whole or being like whole despite. I feel like in the case of like fragments, like there's both. There's themes of separation that are like a big part of my life and a big part of being Vietnamese. And I've spent a lot of years like lamenting it and like, just feeling a lot of trauma and pain and just wrestling with it. And then there's also like this attempt to do something that has like multifaceted aspects that's like maybe a form of like trying to bring the pieces back together or trying to synergize something or just, or accepting the fact that there's like multiplicity, especially in regards to like Vietnam's history and the whole, we're just talking about like what happened around the Vietnam War era and there being, just all these multiple sides and stories to it that, especially in our rhetoric, have been really polarized, and also erasing, like the South Vietnamese perspective. And then, beyond that, there's also like there's more to being Vietnamese than just like the Vietnam War. And that's something else that is part of the identity, I guess.
Yeah. And I feel like, so the photographs, not just the hexagram at the beginning, but you create this sort of ability, I think, for the reader to have multiple interpretations and multiplicity, because with the photographs that often the figures are cut off in half, or part of the something's left out of the frame, or maybe part of the picture is obscured. But you also do this with the text. The text feels very unstable, and even the title, where it's you will always be someone from somewhere else, but the word else is is a smaller font. It's in lowercase and it's italicized. So you could almost at first glance think it says, "You will always be someone from somewhere," which feels like totally different
than that. Yeah.
But I was hoping we could start, since your personal biography plays such a big role in the poetry collection and in the memoir. If we could talk about the gaps and erasures in your own biography, both the irretrievable things because of the things that you have no memory of, and then the things that some of the things that were actively erased or withheld. So could we unpack some of that
like
for
some
people?
of the stuff that's in the memoir, like well, I was born in Vietnam, and my mother was pretty much at the time, by the time we left, she was a single mother with 2 young children. And she decided to leave, and we left in '75, and we landed in the States in Camp Pendleton in San Diego, and then we were moved to another refugee camp which was called Hope Village out in the Sacramento area, which is kind of where my mother, she wrote an article for the Sacramento Bee, like with some help from local reporters, and she had been a writer in Vietnam, and kind of told her story about being a refugee and a war widow, and then she received some letters in response to that, and one of the letters was from my stepfather, a Danish American man who, was moved by the story and just offered to help, and was like wanted to meet her. I mean, they ended up basically meeting, and they went on a date, and they got married literally like 2 weeks later, And then, so our family, our American family, was born from that seed very quickly. And then we were, we moved in Sacramento. So all the time that I was growing up, I was told that my real father had died in the war. And that was kind of the story that I grew up with. And then when I was 13 or 14, I remember, talking to my mother. We were driving in the car, and she basically told me, I have something to tell you. Your father's actually alive, and he's in a re-education camp in Vietnam, and he'd been there since 75. So basically, it was almost like 10 years or something, and that he had been a writer. So I had this other narrative, and I remember going to school, like I was a freshman in high school, and I remember going to school like that next week and telling my friends at lunch, like I had this like weird story to tell them. And so for me, it was like this kind of story, and it never crossed my mind that was like something that I would ever meet him, because in the 80s, that's pretty much, what people believed. Like that's what my mother was living, and what other Vietnamese people of that generation were living, that like very possibly like nobody was going to return to Vietnam, and that people in Vietnam weren't going to get out of Vietnam. So that's pretty much what I grew up with. That's kind of one of the big formative, narratives. And I think because of the family that I was growing up in, and the way that my mother and my stepfather were very focused on, you sever from the past and you just move on, and this was their survival method, I didn't think much about it emotionally.
Yeah.
Until like my 20s. And it was actually when I was in graduate school at Iowa, and I had this travel stipend that was like part of my fellowship when I was there. So I had this opportunity to return to Vietnam. And I had this opportunity to look for my father. And my mom basically, gave me the address of a friend who would know where he was. And so that's when I did. So that's one of the big erasures, I guess, of my...
Yeah. I mean, I feel like your book, the last 2 books in particular, could, if it was just about irretrievable memory, because you were too young when your family fled the fall of Saigon and came to the United States to have primary memories, you would still be dealing with fragments and trying to make meaning from an absence. But then on top of it, you have a family structure that's withholding or erasing for their own survival. Yes. But it's a very American thing in the sense that it feels like your mom doesn't want to talk about the past because she wants you to be free.
Yes.
And similarly, your stepdad, he doesn't go back to Denmark at any point.
Yeah.
And you aren't speaking Danish or Vietnamese in the home. You're speaking English. So they're everyone's turned away from something.
Yeah. And I think that, like, for me, like, that caused, like, this thing inside me that actually was pretty painful. Like, it's like a, kind of, I think somewhere in my late adolescence when I realized that, like, my stepdad never went back to Denmark. His mother was waiting for him to return. He, like, left in his 20s and told her he would be back in 2 years, and then he just never returned, like, even to visit. Like, I realized that there's something that, or I got this sense that there's something that happens psychically in a person in order to do that. And so there's a big cost basically involved and I associated that with, like, this American concept of self-reinvention. So there's, like, we have this opportunity to totally rewrite ourselves and maybe rewrite our history or restart it. But it's also at this, like, if you want to call it emotional cost or psychological cost, like, there is something that gets severed.
Or sometimes a cost that's put on another people.
Like, to think that your children are not going to suffer it is that's a question. Like, it's hard. Like, I have my own personal feelings about it, but I realize, like, it's like maybe just something to leave open-ended, as in, like, some people are fine with it, and they do. They don't need that attachment to the past. But yeah.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking to Dao Strom about her poetry collection, You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else. If we look at your 4 books in the broadest sense and the trajectory, and I may be projecting something that's not there, but I'm curious to your thoughts, it feels like they move from the more conventional to the less conventional, and also to more maybe avant-garde presses as well. So your first book, a novel with some biographical elements.
Yeah.
And then your second book, a collection of stories with Vietnamese American protagonists, but that defies some expectations, particularly, I think, of white readers of what a Vietnamese story should look like. But then we take this leap in your memoir and in this poetry collection, and we're now in a world of image, text, and music in the memoir, and image and text here. And I wondered if that parallels this move towards hybridity and hybrid text, if that parallels not being able to tell the story you want to tell the way you want to tell it in these or other forms.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are, like, events. There are reasons, like, just career reasons why, like, all of that has happened along the way. And I guess to sum it up, I would say that, like, I did a lot of my early learning through, like, very, like, standard Western or narrative forms. I guess a form of, like, being indoctrinated or being colonized by, like Western ideas and growing up in, like, white spaces. Like, I grew up in a very small, a rural town that was largely white people and also very Christian. And I went to the IR Writers Workshop, which some people will say that is more narrative-based. Definitely at the time that I was there, and I was in the fiction program. So, realistic fiction of a certain type was prevalent. So I think, like, it's kind of like I learned through these forms, and even musically, like, I started my learning with, like, folk and country music. So I think kind of moving into, like, at some point, like, just I was always struggling with form, even in that first book, and having a hard time, like, just whatever I needed to do or say or how I needed to say it, like, it was having a hard time fitting into those containers. And I guess, like, it just kind of ended up breaking out or just or needing to. So it was really a process for me to try to open myself up to, like, finding a more experimental way and finding this hybrid form. And these threads had always been parallel without me really realizing it. Like, I studied film when I was an undergraduate, so it's like the visual was, there. Like, I was interested in it early on, and then I started playing music sometime in my early 20s. So it's like all these things were kind of, I feel like, maybe unconsciously being prepared for me to find like this hybrid form that incorporated the three voices. And so it hasn't been easy. Like, it's been a very searching path for part of the time, but it's, I think I've found more of like what I was supposed to do or how I was supposed to listen to my own voice when I came upon the hybrid form.
Yeah. So. I'm going to read a quote of yours that I really love, and then I want to ask you something about some of the form in the poetry collection. So you once said, "Hybridity is a way of saying we are neither this nor completely that. At the same time, we are this and we are that, maybe even that other that too. And it's all subject to change. We might dissolve or evolve any boundaries. We will not stay put where you think you've safely placed us, named us, tried to corral us. Neither this nor that, neither of here nor there wholly. Such territories are not always supported, condoned, understood, or even accurately perceived by either the heres or theirs the artists have strayed from. They abide in a state of ambiguity, hard to define, unwilling to capitulate, limboed in a sort of accepted tenuousness of being." That's an amazing quote. But I was hoping maybe you could speak to that in the ways in which, well, in general, but also in the ways that you're employing parentheticals in the poetry collection, and also the plus and plus minus that appears throughout the book.
Yeah, I guess there's something about ambiguity and there's something about contradiction that is important to me. And maybe there's something about indefinition, which, like, even as I speak, I risk like trying to define it. And I think anybody who's an artist like kind of understands, like, you're doing this dance with this like creature, or this like, force that's like hard to pin down. And then at the same time, we live in a society which really likes to have like, categories and have things like be pretty concrete and defined and be able to talk about things like, really succinctly. I think that I'm trying to honor some other like type of principle or some other type of rhythm in doing this hybrid work. And it has to do with Vietnam, and it maybe also has to do with the feminine, and like whether you want to call it feminist or feminine, like maybe it's some other it's the opposite of the yang, like concrete, physical, material modes of action in the world. And so...
Do you associate the feminine or the feminist with the hybrid?
It's like, I feel like that might be like too simple to say, but it's definitely something different than whatever is, prevalent in a patriarchal
like
or
a
materialist
hero narrative.
Yeah, like, so it's like I guess I think of the Western narrative, or just like as having one main character and one main through line, and having being based more on plot, on like action. So maybe the opposite of that is something that is passive and something that it deals with interiority, or a sort of amorphousness, and that is indirect. So maybe those are qualities that that have like spoken to me more, I guess, or like that make that are more aligned with whatever I'm trying to do. And yeah, so I feel like that relates to Vietnam in some crucial way. Maybe it's just for me, but I feel like maybe that's like the underrepresented, or the side that we're not listening to as much. And I don't know. I'm kind of like, my mind is like wandering, but I think about the metaphor of a cave, and I've talked to other people about like the caves in Vietnam, And there's, this very big cave system in central Vietnam. I don't know if you've heard of it, the Phong Nha caves.
Uh-huh.
And according to like some of the stories that I've read, like it's like there's one cave that is purported to be the world's largest cave, and it was only recently, they say, discovered or like open to the public, like, recently, like, I don't know, I think it was 2013 or something. But like, to me, that's like this metaphor of like, there's this whole like interiority that has existed in a land and in a culture, and, and it hides this different kind of beauty, and it hides this different kind of landscape, and it's always been there. But from our perspective, like the stories that we're reading about it, we're just, it's being exposed now or whatever, or some French explorer or Australian, like, explorer has like helped, the rest of the world be able to go and visit this place. So I guess that's like, for me, I think about that in terms of Vietnam, that there's like this whole, I don't know, like there's more like underneath the surface. And then I guess I think about like how to apply that in terms of art, or does that make any sense?
That does make sense. It feels like you're destabilizing the notion of country too, because you have this meditation.
Yeah.
Or, well, in the hybrid quote, you talk about neither here nor there and both here and there, which, of course, when I think of your biography, I'm thinking of the United States and Vietnam as two of two things that could fit into that calculus. Yeah. But then you have this meditation in the book. The root of the word country takes us back to contra, against, and to a phrase where the concept of country is arrived at via an act of seeing the terrain spread out before one, terra contrata. The body must separate itself from what it views in order to name said vision. Hence, the act of first sighting or sighting land also becomes one's initiation of separation. Yeah. Which is interesting. Like, it seems like only a hybrid form where you could stand in two places at once could somehow solve this idea that of country not being a separation.
I think that like a lot of people in the diaspora might relate to that idea of like, neither here nor there, like we are of like these many places all together. And I feel like that applies, like it can apply to a lot of people and like just to different degrees. But maybe it's also an attempt to free ourselves, or for me to free myself from like this attachment of identity. It's really hard to figure out like, where to base my identity. And I think at my core, I have kind of a resistance toward defining identity in terms of like, nation or geography or culture, even though, I'm really Vietnamese. I like, there's a ethos and there's a history and there's like all this that I strongly identify with. But at the same time, I don't, or I like, I'm kind of open to letting it be contradicted.
Yeah. If you don't mind, maybe this is a good time just to read a brief one paragraph on page 10.
Okay. Sometimes parents will give their children mythologies when they can no longer stomach history. From my mother, I learned the prototypical origin myth, that one about the hand lifting earth to mouth, and the inconceivability of the mountain to hold the water that inevitably leaves her for the sea. Mythologies have their way of explaining the basic human condition, that there will always be somewhere or thing you wish to get to or back to, which is another way of saying they explain wars. Longing is a state of mind, which is also to say longing is a mental love.
We've been listening to Dao Strom read from You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else. So when I think of giving one's kids mythologies when you can no longer stomach history, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about your family a little bit. Not just your family, obviously, but this idea of the American dream and of dreaming and of like an aspirational visioning that sort of reminds me of sleepwalking in a way, like you're enacting what's in your head, but you're not really aware of where you are at the same time. I don't know if that makes sense, but it feels like in your last two books, you're part of what you're unpacking are the two countries' dreams, and troubling them and making them more complex, like the way you're discovering these caves in Vietnam. So, the way in America, Vietnam, for a lot of non-Vietnamese Americans, might just refer to a war and not a country. Or the Ken Burns documentary talking almost entirely to white veterans. Or like in the Vietnam Memorial in D.C., I think it was Viet Thanh Nguyen who quoted a photographer who said that if it were to contain all the names of the people who were Vietnamese who died, it wouldn't be 150 yards long, but 9 miles long.
Yeah.
You wrote this essay called Vietnam as a 7-letter word.
For diacritics.
Yeah, and it's about the ways in which when you've gone and performed your music or read some of your work, the ways it's prompted white war veterans to approach you in a specific way, and then you meditate on this. It's really fascinating to me, and I was hoping maybe you could just share a little bit of your thoughts about it, and that time before Viet Nguyen was a celebrity when he was just here at Powell's on Hawthorne, and there were 15 people in the audience. How he was involved a little bit in this story. Can you talk a little bit about?
I went to see. I wrote the essay in response to the Ken Burns documentary came out in, I guess, last fall, and I don't think I'm alone in like a lot of the Vietnamese American responses were just kind of like that it's still telling an American narrative, and I guess as I see it, Americans are kind of obsessed with themselves, and then are I feel like this is like not the most accurate word, but I want to say like patriarchal culture is like obsessed with the experiences of men and men in war. And so like a lot of and I know there's a lot of trauma that the nation and that like the men who served in there are obviously going through. But I went to this reading when Viet came to Powell's, and that was before he won the Pulitzer. And there weren't that many people in the audience. And of course there were some vets in the audience who, and I'd had this experience too, when I read that, there would always be some older middle-aged white men there who had served, and they're like, there for, I guess, the content because it has to do with Vietnam. But then we went out later, and one of the vets was sitting at the table with us in the bar. And I just remember it kind of evolved into the 3 Asian people at the table listening to, this white veteran, like talking, and he was talking about his trauma. And I don't want to like say it in this like judging like way. I mean, it's very real, and I recognize that as a need, and most of the times I've been happy to listen. But it is just an example of like white trauma taking up space at the table. So that even when we're like criticizing war, or even when like literature is like criticizing like the American presence and foreign policies in other lands, it's still kind of obsessed with like even America's like culpability or something. And I feel like that's, to the detriment of like actually still listening or letting the other voices, the marginalized voices, have some room at the table to speak and tell stories that maybe don't include, themselves in relation to America. And I think both as a woman and as like a Vietnamese person, like there's this thing that happens where, I guess like my body or my presence becomes like a catalyst to or just something like a sounding board or a catalyst or something against which, like, the American experience, or I don't know, I'm getting a little bit inarticulate now about
No,
it.
I think you're
But
you're being really articulate.
but and so it's, I look at it from a point of observation. Oh, it's interesting. But I also, as I get older and as it goes on, I get a little tired of it, and I'm trying to push back as far as, like, I think that, it's time to hear those other stories, and I guess it's time for us, like, who are more marginalized to say something about it.
Well, that's why I thought a little bit about this idea of dreaming, in the sense that it would be different if, say, the white veterans were showing up at these events and then they were going out afterwards and saying, "I just want to hear what you have to say."
Yeah,
Then
largely not.
Then if you're sort of like playing a role in their dream, essentially, like, or their nightmare, in this case, and they need you there as sort of a secondary piece to their recovery.
Yeah, it's definitely us. I think that in some of those cases, maybe it's a need for some affirmation or some connection to a Vietnamese person that tells them, that recognizes that they suffered too, or maybe even like some, want of reconciliation or forgiveness or something. And almost it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who the person is individually. It's like, it's just having that, Vietnamese or that Asian body there to, like, kind of reflect that experience off of. I think it kind of goes back to a form of narcissism that Americans have, or that America has, like, if I want to just generalize it. I mean, it's,
Well, and what it makes me think of too is when I think about the challenges of what you're trying to write. So we have the challenges of you not having a memory, just by the chance of how old you were during the refugee experience, and then your family creating a narrative that's sort of decoupled from your past and your history, and then you don't have the audience here coming to the work with neutrality. They've come with a sense of thinking they know.
Yeah, like they have a certain idea of what a Vietnamese person or Vietnamese American person is or should be. I think that is like one of the biggest obstacles or limits for Vietnamese American writers, but for Asian American writers in general. It's just that the, white readership, or just the general American readership, which is not always white, has this, like, very limited context for what they expect of the Asian American experience. And it's usually having to do with, like, whether it's like immigration or like refugee, like resettlement and assimilation, and just ideas of family and food, I notice, is like a big trope that, like, expecting Asian writers to write about food or family. And I think that, like, I'm aware of working in a context where there isn't, like, a lot of information or context already placed for the story that I'm trying to tell, or the history that I'm working in. So the nuances are, are not as legible or accessible, I guess, to, a wider readership. And I guess I accept that as part of it. And then, like, I want to work in a space where I'm writing for, I don't know who I'm writing for, but I know that I'm not trying to write for, like, a white audience. I'm not trying to cater to, like, having to instruct or give that context. And I'm glad there's other people that are doing it. And then I feel like it falls on that first generation, or, like, crop of writers to really do a lot of that work of, like, what happened and what the context. And I think that part of, like, working in hybrid forms, like, it might also be kind of a defense mechanism that I've put up in a way, but not totally consciously, but where like I've noticed that sometimes I've gone into reading situations or talking about it, and people actually like ask about the form, or like they're like, what's going on with this, rather than like focusing on kind of the sensational details of like, you know, my life, or that my father was in a re-education camp. And I think I'm like purposefully trying not to write those things in a conventional narrative fashion where they can be like made into a, you know, just a drama. Yeah. So there's something about using the form in that way too. That's, that I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but I feel like Khi Nao is, we've had conversations about this too, where it's just like, you know, even though she wasn't writing about Vietnamese characters, she was saying that her work was very Vietnamese. So in a way, like, I think that that's similar, like with the hybrid forms. Like, I feel like what I'm doing is there's something, you know, Vietnamese about it. There's something that is particular to my background and to whatever perspective I'm trying to, you know, evoke or give space for.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we were to also look at the way Vietnam dreams itself into being. So here we're talking about the way America dreams itself and dreams Vietnam. But in that short excerpt you read, it hints at the folk tale of the mountain mother and the dragon father that have to divide their 100 offspring. And you sort of use that and other things that are braiding collective memory and self formation of selfhood with your own personal biography. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the way you interrogate the Vietnamese self-identity as a country of fighting off. And I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit. And if there's a relationship, maybe you can explain a little bit about why that is the case, what that identity is. And then I wonder, because I feel like you crave to find something before this identity of a country at war, even way before the French and the Americans. And is that somehow about finding, I don't want to psychoanalyze, but is that also somehow about leaping that gap of memory too, like the origin before the absence?
Those are all like astute reads, like definitely. Vietnam has its mythologies too. And like growing up as a Vietnamese person in America, and I can't speak for Vietnamese people in Vietnam, but one of the things that I was told, and this is a story my mom retold, was this folk tale about this origin myth. And you know, there's a fairy mother, she's this whatever goddess or something, and then there's a dragon father, and they have 100 children and then they're separated. And my mom told this story as like kind of a metaphor also for the separation of like North and South Vietnam, so that this element of necessary separation was like at our core, and kind of irreconcilable, you know, and then this, you know, it kind of, the myth sort of like projects itself onto the exodus of like the South Vietnamese people in 1975, and then we're scattered like, you know, all over the world. And I guess there's that, and then there was also the history of Vietnam, that we weren't just at war with the Americans. We've been at war for, you know, 1,000 years, like against the Chinese for like, you know, centuries. So we've always been fighting, and we're essentially like a warrior people, and we fight for our independence. And we're always like, you know, fighting off invaders. So there's this like fierce independence in that mythology too, and a fierce attachment to, you know, Vietnam, whatever that culture or the soil is. So I guess, like part of my question and part of the irony in the title, which is just a phrase that came to me, you know, we were meant to be a gentle people. Like it obviously doesn't totally fit with that warrior mythology. So maybe in a sense, I am looking for something before, or I was asking, and that was a question I was asking, is like, who are we before like these wars, or who are we before we are identified in juxtaposition or in opposition with like another force? which also kind of goes back to the feminine, masculine, and this definition of war and separation, that there's always so there's, I don't have the answers to that. And then, I mean, there are you can look further into Vietnamese mythology and find we were a matriarchal society. Actually, it was the women that owned property, and then there's hints of these earlier cosmologies that point to other. But that's a really simplistic way of just deducing it too. So I'm
Right.
kind of resistant to just saying we should return to that. So I'm that's part of the search, I guess.
But try the attempt to try to stick your head outside of the dream.
Yeah.
In a way, you have this anecdote you share about visiting son of a friend of your mother in Bellevue, Washington.
Yeah.
Who's, for him, he just totally flips the script. He sees the diaspora as this the Vietnamese diaspora as this great moment of opportunity, and what a wonderful time to be alive as a Vietnamese person, because it's the first time that millions of us are scattered across the globe versus just being in Vietnam. Which I'm not saying that, I'm not putting that forth as something to endorse as a viewpoint, but as just maybe the surprise someone might feel at hearing it told outside of the expected narrative.
But I think it's both ways. That might be the reality, is that it can be looked at in both ways, where maybe it's just a fundamental a human experience. Do you look at there is something that attachment to country and attachment to nation and attachment to tradition were definitely things that somebody like my mother was trying to break free of, because Vietnam is also a really patriarchal country and culture, and it can be argued that it wasn't always. So something something happened somewhere, and I don't have all the history details, but I think that there's probably a point when there was a shift, and for somebody like my mother growing up in the 60s, 70s, it was really restrictive, or just, you're expected to get married and then you move into your husband's household and you take care of the family. And things like being a writer or smoking cigarettes or just, there were so many things that my mom was doing that were very rebellious, or being being sexually expressive. So I see that there's when something gets too rigid, there's a positive aspect to it breaking free, or just and maybe that's the interpretation of the diaspora, when it's so there's freedom in realizing we're not attached to anything, or we can become something else, or we can be all of these things at once, and it can be an empowering thing. But then it can also be something to lament if you are of the nature of somebody who wants to be attached to place and family, and a little more sentimental about those things. So I guess I kind of I can see both sides, and I feel both sides actually too. And I don't have an answer to it being one way or the other, but I feel it's kind of a fundamental tension that we inhabit.
Well, maybe this is a good time for people to hear a little bit more of the poetry.
It goes back, all the way back to when the world was covered in early mists. I know there are times even before this one, but here is where my memories begin. There is a whiteness to the land, and a startling clear quality to the atmosphere, an opalescence. Our bodies have something of this opalescence, and our faces have no features, not like faces have now. You might even say our bodies are translucent, or parts of what is inside merge with parts of what is outside. We sense rather than see, and we are sexless too. Or we are still forming our sexes in this time. We are nomadic in this time. Until comes a point when the land begins to harden and form dark patches amid the whiteness, land bridges are forming. It's the best phrase I have for them. Terrestrial matter that bridges something otherwise untenable. And something about the new land makes us slow down and stay longer, way more than we normally would in a season. And here we begin to encounter others who are slightly different from us, denser. And somewhere in here, too, love is ignited. I don't know why for sure, but it is. Something grows in the space between our legs. She is sitting on the ground, the shape of her like a basket or stone, rounded on the outside, fluid and mysterious inside. She is brown, a brown form in a world of white. She is earth, and in this time I am like something descended from the sky or made of sky. In her I see how tired I am growing. I am coming down looking for a home, for a place to land. You will travel far in the company of men with paler skin than you, duller skin over time. You will feel sometimes acutely tired, but you will also find it difficult to rest. You will feel lonely, very likely, often. You will at times feel that you miss someone or thing you cannot remember. You will come to places where sometimes the trees, the lay of the land, the music and the movement of the water, the way the light strikes objects, these simple forms of witness, will almost remind you of who or how it was. You will love deeply just a few times. This will become your best vehicle for remembering. Love, this particular kind, will snap you out of it, your father's world, at those times when you most need it. And then you will know, daughter, our ideas are real. So much that we forget. I forget that in another time we knew each other importantly. I forget the day dawned without time, without thought, and I stood watching the sun, reading the sky. I forget there were breachers and watchers and seers. I forget there were hunters and helpers. I forget there were rivers that were our friends and our meeting places. I forget there were markers once to tell us how far we'd come, and then somewhere along the way they just stopped, meaning we'd gone further than any of us had ever gone before. I forget the ocean heaved when the sky broke. I forget whether the water came from above or below or both. I remember you, though. You walked, I ran. The water was our agency. A flash of white connected us, an idea of union, like an envelope encasing me with only that whom I loved.
We've been listening to Dao Strom read from You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else. So, speaking of dreams and origin stories, there's one, a country that existed for 20 years, South Vietnam, that no one really talks about, but which both of your biological parents have a lot of, I would guess, I don't know if nostalgia is the right word, but a lot of esteem for the project of the country, or at least the dream of the project of South Vietnam when it did exist. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you think they might articulate that dream, and then the ways in which what they were accused of as urban intellectuals as the political climate changed.
Yeah. Well, South Vietnam technically, I guess, existed from 1954 to 1975. And that would have been, my mom came from the north with her family in 54, and she was 10 at the time. So she came of age in South Vietnam. And the way she described it to me was, the country was at war. That was also the time in which, like, the Americans were occupying South Vietnam. But it was also like a time of a lot of influences coming in from outside. So she got a lot of exposure to things like Western culture and democracy and, the Beatles and like, just things like that where
Right.
it's like, so all these things were coming in and they kind of like, for her, like expanded her way of thinking about the world and thinking about what was possible. And she was, like, she was really into education. Like she has this story about how she, instead of spending the money that she was supposed to spend on food, she bought books, and she was defying her father in like wanting to go and take, classes on French literature or something. And she, I guess, started writing stories pretty early, and she published when she was young, and she was part of a group of Vietnamese women writers who were considered very modern and very like pioneering in that time. They were nicknamed the Five She-Devils, and my mom was one of those writers. And she was saying, she'll describe it as like things were very easy to make happen at that time. Like I think there was like a lot of energy where like somebody could just like write something and publish it, or they could be like, let's make a movie and like, let's start a newspaper. And so there was that energy of like people wanting to do these things. And so all these things were happening. And they were very aware of like also living in a time of, contradictions and corruptions. The South Vietnamese government had corruption in it. And at the same time, knowing that the communist, government was not better, like there had been atrocities that the communist government, had committed, so people knew about these things. And my mom and my birth father they were the founders of a newspaper. And I'm not going to, my Vietnamese pronunciation is not perfect, but it was called Song Tan. And the title translates to tidal wave. And that was their idea for that name, was like this tidal wave of, action or truth or justice or whatever they were fighting was, that was what their newspaper was going to be about. And they were just trying to, I think, tell the truth or just, like resist.
And it wasn't a small paper, was it?
It was a fairly large, I don't know the exact numbers, but it was well known. So in the Saigon intellectual community of that time, they were well known. And like my mom is like, she's famous. Like, and I put like whatever that means in terms of, having been like a semi-famous intellectual in pre-1975 Saigon. It's something that I'll encounter occasionally, like people of her generation. And if I say what my mom did, they'll have heard of her newspaper, or they'll have heard of her. And there's other writers that she's still in the circle of. But it's also this interesting history because it's been erased officially. So, after 75, a lot of those writers were banned and their books were burned. And my mom's, included on that list. So they're not in the official, record of, the communist Vietnam's history. And then also, in America, of course, a lot of that's not translated, or it's not translated well, and a lot of people don't care, just because it's just too much nuance as far as trying to understand, what South Vietnam was trying to do. So that's another interesting erasure. And I think that if you talk to a South Vietnamese person, and there are people trying to do this work, even something like the Ken Burns documentary, or the popular conception of South Vietnam would be that we were corrupt and we were the puppet government, or just the people needed the Americans' help. They couldn't win the war without it, or they didn't know what they were doing, or just, this kind of victim, inferior complex. And so I think if you speak to a South Vietnamese person, especially of that generation, they would want you to know that they were, fighting effectively, and that there were also efforts in the citizenship, and that there was a lot going on. And my mom's newspaper is one example of that, of an example of citizens, people, kind of a grassroots effort to, I guess, take care of their own society. Or so that's some of the history that was going on at that time. And it like if I think about like I was born to a temporary country, like it's kind of this line or this concept that I think of, like it's, you know, it's just an interesting thought, like, you know, it doesn't exist anymore technically. And so it's like it can be both liberating or it can be both like kind of startling or, you know, unsettling. And my father, he chose to stay. So after that, you know, 75.
And one aspect of erasure in your history that we didn't mention is that when he does come to the States, he wants to write a memoir about his experience in the re-education camps, but then deletes the memoir before anyone sees it.
That was just one conversation that I had with him. And I haven't spent a lot of physical time with him. Like it's, you know, it's been just a handful of visits. But yeah, I remember having that conversation with him, and I wrote about that particular conversation where he, you know, had been working on a memoir and then he deleted it. And I don't know exactly why, or except that it's, you know, maybe just like there's not, you know, it's hard to tell a story like that. But in reality, he's still, like, he actually is a publisher. Like he runs a publishing, you know, he publishes Vietnamese writers. And as far as I understand, he's publishing a lot of Vietnamese writers that can't get published in Vietnam, who are, you know, would be, you know, considered like dissident or just have a hard time, you know, being published by the state. And I think that there is just maybe the major, like, as far as I understand it, and I don't want to speak to like as if I'm an authority on like it, but I think that in Vietnam there are state-run publishing or state-approved publishing houses. But then there is a lot of underground publishing happening.
Yeah. Well, in your memoir, you say you have a line that says something like "language is the orphaner." That made me think of two ways in which that was true for you, in the sense that literally the language of your parents is part of what causes the flight to the United States. And then the other is the withholding of language, that you aren't taught Vietnamese, and that you're part of an active attempt to be free of history.
Yeah.
And you wrote, I think, on Diacritics about how sometimes you'll meet other Vietnamese people or Vietnamese Americans, and they'll say, so you're Vietnamese, but you are not really Vietnamese, when they discover that you don't speak the language. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in that in regards to, I think, the attempt of Diacritics and probably decanon in a larger sense for people of color, but certainly your two books of inviting a less essentialist view of what it means to be of any group, essentially.
Good way to, like, that's a good way to describe it, just as essentialist. I think I'm not alone. And I think, there's Vietnamese people, like, there is this attachment to language being like access to the culture. And there are people who will just very much, like, if you don't speak, even though I meet somebody's like parents and they try to speak to me in Vietnamese and they realize that I don't speak it, and then just like something happens, like there's this shift of like, you know what they're thinking, like they're like disapproving of my mother, or they're wondering what happened, you know. And it's so it's very real that there is that level of like bias or prejudice. And then I guess I feel like Diacritics and the other writers that are involved in that mission, a lot of us aren't fluent, and yet we're still, you know, wrestling with being Vietnamese and this history in our families, and sharing a lot of the, you know, just the things that have happened, or just there's similar traumas or similar reactions and wounds. And so I guess, like, I'm, in a lot of ways, I'm trying to get beyond language, or I'm trying to like, it's like language is important, and language is access, and it's a way of communication, but it's also a way of limiting, like, us. We also fail to communicate, and we also fail to recognize people who aren't communicating in the same language that we recognize. So, and then we also...
Or we use it to separate.
Yeah, we also use language like as rhetoric and as propaganda. And I'm very aware of that in terms of like, well, writing fiction, or just in terms of like, you know, the way the communists use language, or the way that like, you know, just even like words like freedom, or words like, you know, there's this rhetoric that language can be used for. And so I think there's a part of me that is, all of that is suspect. And it's another, like, it's like, it's both here and it's both there kind of thing, where it's like, yes, I dwell in words and I obsess about them. And, you know, I like have gained a lot from like living a life, like, you know, and then there's also this realization that it's English. So it's also the language of like the colonizers. So there's so many levels of complexity to language, and that might be where I also like aspire to music, where it's just like, okay, I don't know, like there's
and juxtaposing the language with image.
Yeah, like trying to
create some sort of entry way that's different.
Yeah, or challenging the authority of like what language is supposedly telling us.
Yeah, which makes me think, when you were mentioning Khi Nao,
Mm-hmm.
and what she said on this show, actually,
I love
and
that.
you'd
Yes.
written this thing, and I was just going to read the quote because it was so great. If I can find it here. So Khi Nao said, "I do feel that there is a lot of the Vietnamese language in my writing. It's just invisible. When people say, 'This sentence is strange,' I don't think it's strange. It just has a lot of Vietnamese in it, my Vietnamese past in it. And so it gave that English word or sentence that slant. It has my somatic system of Vietnameseness embedded within, between each word of the English word, or between the letters of that English word, that when people read it, they think, 'Oh, your work is really strange and poetic.' I don't think it's strange and poetic. I think it's because I lived in Vietnam. I was an immigrant. We were refugees. When I read my work, I'm like, this is so Vietnamese, but it doesn't look like Vietnamese. It doesn't even sound like Vietnamese. But there is a phantom sonic volume that is quiet and silence. And I want to say that silence, that invisibility, is very Vietnamese. It tastes and sounds like pho, and when you eat it, you feel like you're eating something very postmodern, but it's traditionally Vietnamese."
I love that.
Yeah,
She captured it so like beautifully. Yeah.
And she speaks Vietnamese.
She does.
So that's interesting to hear
Yes.
her operating in the English world.
Yeah. Yeah.
By choice to some degree, but also probably based also on the reality of like the publishing world where she lives.
Sure. Yeah.
And that she's seen it there beyond letters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think she captures like this sense of, I mean, she's also used the word tenderness about like the language. And I guess that's when like sometimes when I've described like what it means to me to be Vietnamese, like there's an ethos about it. And yeah, it's hard to describe, but it's, you know, it has to do with the sorrow. It has to do with like the way that we've like absorbed what has happened throughout history. And then like there is a certain ethos that's reflected, that ache, it's hard to articulate.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I'm going to have you read another a little short piece.
A separation myth is a middle-class prestige we pull. My own marriage has more than once been beset upon by it. One year, I thought a cure might be enacted by returning together to the place I'd previously traveled to alone, which was also the originating place I'd been severed from. I wore wings for this trip. We traveled along hectic, inhospitable roads to the oldest standing stones we could make our way to. The ruins of the Champa civilization were called discovered in the late 1800s by French archaeologists who were enthralled at having found such cultural treasures. The Vietnamese, who presumably already knew of those stone feats in the jungle, may have thought it just as well to let the jungle keep them, for you have to let the jungle have something, or she will take back everything eventually. But white men come, and often they are intent on saving or vanquishing when they do. On our marriage saving trip, I hauled my wings in a blue plastic case from north to south. Everywhere we went, the items we bought, entry fees we paid, cost double or triple the local fare, exacted from us with distrustful, scrutinizing eyes. Some charges were blatantly duplicitous. At moments, anger would mount in me. "I'm from here too," I wanted to shout, "and I've spent a lifetime caring and carrying what you think I've forgotten, what you think making us pay more for now will somehow vindicate." At the same time, I understood well enough where the urge for retribution came from, the years and dynamics implicit, wool-sick nature of my own tongue, white partner beside me. At the Dalat airport, the security officer sent me back to the airline desk to pay more tacked-on fees, and at Tan Son Nhut, we had to buy our air tickets to Cambodia twice. These small harassments felt like tolls being exacted for something I could not quite put my finger on. Then I set my wings down in the Siam Reap airport, and they were gone when I turned back for them.
We've been listening to Dao Strom read from You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else. So can you tell us a little bit about the wings? Because we have throughout this book and your memoir, we have a series of photographs of you with wings.
Yeah.
And it's evoking some mythology around wings. Tell us a little bit about it.
It goes back to that origin myth about the fairy mother, who's the mother of the Vietnamese people. I think there's some mythology where there's something about the goddesses, and O Ko is one of the goddesses. She's the mother. And they come down in the form of birds, and then she eats a handful of dirt, and she can't fly back up to the heavens, and so she's left on earth, and her sisters have to leave her. And that's how she ends up becoming the mountain mother. And I guess I had this idea at some point. I had this vision of wearing a pair of wings and standing in a waterfall, and I just this image that I wanted to play with. And so I actually had a pair of wings made, and I had this idea that I wanted to take pictures with them in landscapes, and I wanted to visit the Cham ruins, which they are the indigenous people of Vietnam, and they and in particular, I guess the time that I'd visited before, visiting those ruins was one of the places that I felt the most, just some sense of something, and so I wanted to go back and stand in those places. And I guess I think of the pictures of taking these pictures with the wings as maybe a form of performance, or a form of just creating some sort of mytho-poetic sense for myself or for this world that I'm playing in, and then just I think of the character. So I think of it as a character that I'm playing with, and maybe this character is one of the daughters of this mother who's been separated and been cast out to other places, and is trying to find a way back or something. And
I also wondered about whether it was shifting the meaning of the word flight, or reclaiming the word flight from a negative, war-torn sense to a liberatory one.
Yeah. I mean, I guess flight is a part of it. I wasn't thinking about it that consciously, but I could see that being an interesting way to read it.
Well, I'd imagine when we're talking about a more pluralistic and less essentialist view of being Vietnamese, and yet still encountering prejudice around language or around essentialist nature, regardless of what it is, you going to Vietnam and then feeling like you're taxed there specifically because of what you represent. It must be, I would imagine it must be gratifying to have a bilingual book being put out by a Hanoi-based press that will have a Vietnamese audience in Vietnam, in addition to having the audience here.
I feel really grateful. I feel like it's a wonderful and just fortunate like interaction that I've been able to develop with the Jar Press. It means a lot to me in just the sense of like being able to have the two languages like side by side and playing with each other. And I have to like just emphasize just my own like, I guess, deficiency and kind of humbleness and like that sense of like, you know, I had nothing to do with the Vietnamese translation. Like that was done by Ly Thuy Nguyen and Ly Thuy Nguyen, who is one of the Jar Press editors. Like just the editors have been wonderful in that interaction. And I guess it's a way for me to like explore like the Vietnamese language in like seeing what I understand the English words and then reading the Vietnamese translation and then playing with the placement of them on the pages. And I had done like some work with the Jar Press too, where they translated one of my poems called The Fragments into Vietnamese and did a voice recording of it. And I cut up the audio of that and, you know, juxtaposed it like with the English. So for me, it becomes this exercise of like listening or trying to listen.
It's also important that you mentioned that you're playing with the Vietnamese, because it's not simply one page is your poem in English and then someone has translated it. But there are pages where that's true.
Yeah.
But then there are pages where we get consecutive pages in one language or the other, or that the languages are interbraided or interwoven with each other.
Yeah, I think that my lack of language also plays into my approaching it visually. And that's also like something with the parentheticals and the punctuation marks. Like there is this sense where like the letters and language just become like markings on the page, and they're like things that I move around, or I try to create a different rhythm with that you can see, or that you can hear.
Well, when you go back to them being marks on the page, it's like going back to the pictorial origin of language too.
Which is really fascinating to me. And that's something that I think about also, just that divide between at what point words became, you know, like, signifiers that were abstract versus like our visual sense of the world.
Yeah. Well, when I think about your project at Diacritics with Ly Thuy Nguyen, and you have this great conversation with him, maybe that's part of your passing the torch to you around being the editor.
We did a Q&A.
Yeah, about this desire for having a fluid and pluralistic notion of what it means to be Vietnamese. So while maybe the stereotype of a Vietnamese American would be staunchly anti-communist and pro-American, perhaps, as like a stereotype. The Vietnamese in Germany or Poland tend to be communist, and to like allow for all of these identities as part of the conversation, even ones that are maybe fraught relationships. And then this fraught relationship that you bring up around do you speak the language or you don't speak the language, or maybe people's biases that Vietnamese refugees are all farmers when like your parents were urban intellectuals. It made me wonder, like, for instance, about She Who Has No Masters, this project you're doing of bringing Vietnamese women together for collaborative projects. How easy or difficult has that been? Has that been something, magically frictionless, or has it been something where you find yourselves reiterating some of these attempts to essentialize certain aspects of identity at the cost of other people's experiences?
Well, I would say that, like, I'll like focus on the pluralistic. Like, I guess that project of collectivity and like collaboration and recognizing the multiplicity of voices is like that's been like that's a central force in it. And I think of like it comes out of disconnection. It comes out of like I've written for 20 years, like feeling like I'm like the only Vietnamese person that I know who is like me. And then, gradually, like I have found other Vietnamese writers and found that we all kind of feel the same. Like there's this, sense of we've all been kind of scattered and working in isolation in different ways. And really it's, I guess, working in the midst of other cultures or other communities that we've ended up in. And so there's like, there is a very intentional effort in coming together and trying to collaborate. And I think of a Vietnamese friend of my mom's once that I had a conversation with, who was a history teacher, and she told me that Vietnamese people it was back to that story about them always fighting and being very independent, where she was saying that Vietnamese people are really good leaders, but if you put them all in a room together, they're just going to fight. So I had this, like that was another mythology that I was given, that we're all like, we don't get along. We work better alone. So I guess we're trying to like, test that theory or just, or dismantle it, disprove it. And then also just the fact that there are so many different stories in the diaspora. So at this point, there are so many different ways of being Vietnamese, depending on, everything, like where you've grown up and what the surrounding community is. And so I think that there's a necessity in having like multiple voices in the dialogue, and America maybe wants to make it very simple. Like this is the Vietnamese American experience and it happened this one way, or, just it's an easier thing to understand. But it's so complex. And, yeah. And then part of She Who Has No Master is having this polyvocality or multiple voices is just also another way to kind of defy that like one voice or that Western, structure of there only being like one narrator. And it's...
Do you feel like the inviting of a polyvocality into your work, both your collaborative work and your own work, does that, in the best case scenario, does that involve sort of a process of inviting maybe narratives that are fraught next to each other within oneself, like a self journey, in the sense that when I think about you describing the first time you met your dad in Vietnam, your biological dad, and waiting until near the last day, and then even more so, you having the opportunity to look at some North Vietnamese films, and it felt sort of taboo, and there was a reluctance, like that, perhaps like to really be able to helm a project like Diacritics, or to do image, text, music, poetry collection in 2 languages and in 2 countries. You would have to also make these journeys into things that destabilize one's sense of selfhood,
or like be willing to look at like one's like fallibilities or one's limits. Could you talk about what the experience of like looking at those North Vietnamese films were like, and what you discovered in terms of different gendered narratives that were happening around war? I guess in that particular case, like it's hard to explain. I mean, I can be like, I was busy, but probably it had a little bit to do with like, my mother, or just like that kind of my own like family. My mom's obviously very anti-communist. So if I mentioned the films to her, she would just write them off as like propaganda. And yet they were being taught by this white university professor as, the cinema of Vietnam, and he was doing what he felt like was a justice in like giving space for the North Vietnamese voices. And I remember watching that film. It was called Abandoned Field, and I guess what struck me was that there was like a, I mean, I guess it comes back to that yin yang, like the central image that really stood out to me was this woman with like carrying a baby on her hip and a rifle, like, so she's like this woman warrior figure, and then yet she's like this like nurturing mother, like caretaker, which goes back to like there in Vietnam there is like this attachment or this nostalgia and this reverence for like the feminine in these contradictory ways, where like the warrior woman spirit is like lauded, and then there's also just, you know, the woman is caretaker, just the mother.
And the Trung sister.
Yeah, the Trung
rebellion.
sisters are like they are a national legend, and that's this story about the women warriors who stood up to the Chinese invaders. And it's really interesting because it's like, I think it was, you know, the story goes that they fought the Chinese invaders and then they managed to fight them back. And there was like 3 years of independence. So it's actually like a really short period of time. And then, you know, they were overcome again. And then rather than surrender, they like threw themselves in the river and, you know, drowned. So like there is in that spirit, there's just this like, you know, I'll destroy myself before you know, you can like, you know, that before I'll surrender. And that's like a very strong, like kind of just spirit of passion of like, that I feel like is in that, you know, in the culture. But yeah, like I think I was looking at it from the perspective of cinema. So it's like the imagery, like you see this is how like Vietnam, this is how this North Vietnamese film like made an icon or made an image of like the war. And it was like a woman carrying a baby on her hip. And like it's really interesting. And then you look at like something like Platoon, you know, or the American war movies, which are obviously like this, like that, it just set up this juxtaposition of like, are these the two forces that are
so
at
like
war?
man in the sky and a machine. And
yeah. And then, yeah, there's the, yeah, in that Vietnamese film, there's like the identification with nature and they're hiding under the water. And so whether that's like a reflection of reality or not, it's a reflection of how like mythologies, it's a reflection of certain mythologies that have been presented.
The reason I asked that question about like a self journey is because I think about you growing up in a mostly white, rural, Christian community, and you still now live in a overwhelmingly white city, so 75% white.
Yes.
But nevertheless, you are sort of central and surrounded by a really vibrant community of artists of color here, and also have helped create one with Vietnamese women, and now are helming Diacritics, which is even a larger like network of the Vietnamese diaspora. So it's like, it feels like maybe tracking the way your books have moved, that there's like a process of decolonization of self. Like I think about your piece that you wrote about Iowa pastoral, and you said you were in your early 20s. So, and you came, and your interests were in Carver, Steinbeck, and Sam Shepard, so white writers, and you were listening to country music, and you went to Iowa with this expectation of writing and being taught writing being classless and raceless, like you were going to go. And similarly, you have this interesting piece that's much more recent about Iceland, where you ask, what would it be like, I wonder, to stand on a landmass that has not been subject to any major wars, that has no indigenous people who are unduly colonized, where no bombs have been dropped, no genocide conducted, where the average number of homicides committed per year is an inconceivably low single-digit number. I wanted to know if it would feel different for my body, to be in such a place, because I'd only ever been in geographies rife with histories and identities derived out of a continuing relationship with violence, namely the violence of one power, one body or group of bodies dominating, attempting to erase others. And I wondered, partially like this belief or hope that Iowa would be sort of utopic, and maybe Iceland might also be, if I wonder if that was a reiteration of like what you get from your parents. And then on the other side is this work of sort of complicating narratives and making them more polyvocal. But I wanted to hear your thoughts on it, and maybe also just your experience of Iowa and Iceland versus the dream of Iowa and Iceland.
Yeah, I guess I think of those as two very different places. I guess there's like this idealization of like hoping that there's a place that, you know, that people can exist in harmony and not have these power struggles or these power dynamics. And that's something that, you know, I don't know if that's possible. I guess I would say that the work that has come about, like just being amid like communities of color and working with like diacritics, and it's like all of that has happened without me really like consciously being aware of it or trying. And I don't have an explanation for why or why it's come about now.
It's not all mapped out.
Yeah. Except that, like, you know, whether it's like the place, I don't know if Portland has like necessitated it somehow, in being like the type of like, you know, white environment it is. Like oddly, Portland is the place that I have come into contact with like a stronger, you know, community of like artists of color. And that doesn't make any sense because I've like lived in New York and I've lived in San Francisco. So maybe it was just, I wasn't as conscious of it in those times. But yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, you did have a realization, I think, in that piece about Iceland that even coming to this place, you were seeing the way the artists in the artist residency who were white, who were white and who were able to revel in something about the beauty of it in a less complicated way than you.
I mean, they weren't all white. I'll have to say that. But yeah, I think that one of the things I wrestled with was that I like this identity that I was carrying with me that was wrestling with war and history and trauma was getting in the way of like, you know, I guess just being able to let that go and like enjoy like the actual environment and just the beauty of it. And I guess I carry it with me. And that was what I was like realizing that, I wasn't, you know, like, I wasn't able to just enjoy it as freely. But it was also a realization that like identity can be attached to trauma, or like we can get kind of attached to the things that are difficult that we've identified ourselves by, and then at the same time like be longing to be free of like those karmas or those burdens.
I don't know if this is too personal to ask, but I did wonder, you know, you're a mother, and and you've thought very deeply about your own biography and how it relates to collective memory and to trauma, and also in an empathetic way have looked hard at the choices that your parents have made, which you're not entirely happy with necessarily, but and I was curious what sort of considerations went into raising a Vietnamese American. Yeah,
my son is mixed race, so he's half Vietnamese and half white. I was a young mother, so it was, you know, I became a mother when I was 25, and I would say like the thing that I've tried to give him that I didn't have was like a sense of the past, or that it mattered. That the history of like being from Vietnam mattered. And I think he has that. Like he, you know, at the age of 16 or 17 probably knew more about like the Vietnam War, or was kind of, you know, interested in it than I was at that age. So I hope that matters. And I did take him back to Vietnam with me when I went back in 2014. So I guess I wanted him to have those like just those moments. Like I've took him to meet my birth father, like, so he met his grandfather, and it's small, and I can't say that I know what it means to him. You know, we have a really good relationship, and he cares about the world, and he seems to have like more of a sense of where he came from as far as just what our roots are, and largely due to having a mother who's like, you know, wrestling, like throughout his childhood, I've been wrestling with trying to write, you know, these books. So it's different in that, like, my parents told me it didn't matter. And in the 80s when I was growing up, that's probably what a lot of Vietnamese parents were dealing with. Like, their own trauma made it difficult for them to be able to share those stories, like, evenly with their children. So it's like, you know, it's interesting to see how deeply rooted that the hatred and the fear of the communists are. Like, it really is a source of trauma in many people's families. So yeah, that's the biggest difference, I would say.
Well, before we end, I do want to return to the symbology in the book. I know we started with the hexagram, the wanderer, the lot of the wanderer being separation, but I think perhaps a more important image in the book, or at least as important an image, is the triangle. And we get at the beginning of the book, we get a triangle with a human figure in it, and then we get later a sea of triangles with these images. And then later we get the context of what that person is in the triangle, what iconic photograph, though I wonder how iconic it is to everybody at this point or not. And I was hoping maybe you could speak to the photograph and what it means to you, but also speak to the triangle, because I feel like the triangle.
Which photograph are you?
Of the man leaping.
Oh, that one. Okay, yes.
Of the pilot from the helicopter who's leaping and is caught midair between the helicopter and the ocean. Which I believe he's, if I understand correctly, he's delivering refugees to an aircraft carrier.
Yeah,
perhaps?
it's that photograph in particular is of a South Vietnamese pilot, helicopter pilot, like jumping out of the helicopter, and it's like end of April 1975, and the helicopters were being used to ferry refugees or people leaving to the U.S. air carriers, but there wasn't room for the helicopters, so they were having to push them, you know, into the sea. And that particular instance was like the helicopter had like delivered its passengers, and then the helicopter pilot like flew the helicopter over the ocean and then just jumped out of it and then swam back to the carrier. So
I assumed he was killing himself.
No.
Yeah.
No, I think he survived. Yeah. Or at least, in that, like the stories that
I had infused that photo with a whole narrative.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I'm of the assumption that he swam back to, and there are like accounts of like the pilot jumping out and just, you know, swimming back to the air carrier. But yeah, like I for me, it's just this image that, you know, encapsulates the Vietnamese identity kind of in free fall, like where just everything's being abandoned.
And also maybe, I don't know if this is intentional, but it speaks back to this tension between that North Vietnamese film of like the ocean and nature, and then the machine in the sky, and that person is literally the triangulated being between the two.
I mean, that's like I'm happy to like let that sit. Like that is just a great juxtaposition of the elements at play. The triangles are like, I guess the simplest way I can put them, like just what drew me to them instinctually, is like I'm interested in geometry, and I'm interested in shapes and just the energy of shapes, and the triangle, and especially when you turn it upside down, is a very destabilizing and very dynamic shape. So I had this sense of like, you know, it's both pulling things down. It might be pulling something down from like the sky or from wherever else. And that was like a lot of my play with it on the images, was like, you know, what, like just where that energy is happening. And and I guess I thought of like the upside down ones as being like more destabilizing,
Yeah.
and more like something's like
That's
being
so
pulled
interesting.
down.
Like when we were talking before at the beginning about the difference between taking fragments to build a whole or breaking a whole to
Yeah.
create fragments, and you talking about the triangle as destabilizing, and all along I'm thinking of them as instead of having to choose between one thing or the
Yeah.
other, the triangulation is like a way to choose both and neither, the way you
It's
talked about
true.
with hybridity. So I was thinking about it as
Yeah. Yeah.
the third way, I guess.
Yeah.
Would you mind reading
Sure.
I printed out I think this is from your memoir, but this is about that photograph, this part in bold.
And so perhaps the real question I want to ask on this day, that I would want to ask my fellow inheritors of this free fall moment in history, which can be read as the free fall into or out of an identity, as well the free fall of either the machine or the man, may be, how will you read it? Which element, helicopter or man, will you grieve for more, or will you marvel at more, and why? Which one will you instinctively inside at the first moment of observation root for, worry for, and picture the next movements, the landing of? Will your imagination follow the helicopter as it sinks to its watery grave, or will your imagination follow the Vietnamese man as he hits the water and holds his breath and then starts kicking and pulling to get to the next place he needs to get to be free and keep living? And how will you read it onward in the next frame and the next one, and in the longer series of pictures yet to unfold beyond this one?
I love that as this sort of Rorschach test. Is that how you say it?
Yeah. It kind of goes back to like, are we going to dwell on like, the American machinery or on the human beings?
Well, can you speak, since we touched on the ocean, and I feel like we haven't talked about the importance of the ocean or the sea. It's part of your Twitter handle here in the sea. And then the book opens with a line, which I want to hear about. Mm-hmm. You will always be someone from somewhere else is a design flaw of water. And then the book ends with a map of images called Index for Seeing on Two Shores, which has these ocean-centered maps.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's some wisdom here.
Well, the ocean's a big theme, I feel like, for Vietnamese people, and obviously just like this for displaced people who have crossed seas and who have been in boats, which is still going on. So much happens having to cross that distance. The other interesting part about like the Vietnamese language is the word nuoc, means both water and nation or country. So it's like something that is a theme that's like pretty commonly played with. And I mean, for myself, I guess it's, there's those metaphors or those themes. And then just, I am like a very water, like drawn person. And maybe the sea just has to do with like the unconsciousness and the emotions. Also.
Yeah, I was thinking also like when you're talking about the definition of country, and your body has to be separate from, like it's something against a country that we normally would think of the two countries on either side as being, or we normally would think of a country as being the whole. And if you, with these ocean-centered maps, it feels like the countries on either side are the fragments, and the ocean is the whole.
I like that. Yeah, I mean, it's a focus on the middle space or the process in between.
Yeah.
I guess I think of like hybridity, and just what I'm particularly inclined to is like kind of contemplating that middle space and transitions, and the seams between places. Like I'm probably more aware, more identified with that in-between space than I am with like belonging to one place or another.
Yeah. So maybe we can end with a segment near the end of the collection.
Okay. Great. So this poem is called 11/8/16, which is a date. And are you ready to get a little more comfortable with your uncomfort? I lay next to you, and in my body it will always hit, different than in or for yours. In this world, I enact separation for the sake of spelling accurately the exposure, the distance, unsung textures between your skin and mine. How to cultivate need not run, need not fear, because I have felt alienated on most days. And so what? Stepping onto a stage is always an act of self-isolation, violation, inviolate or inviolable. We ensoul, we insulate, despite introversion, despite inversion, despite our art needs to count even more now. Because momentarily I had forgot white is a color of mourning in the culture of my birth, black the one for anniversaries and birthdays. You see how easily we shift our grief into complementary colors. Consciousness is not the same as instinct or emotion, heart, maybe, which you place conveniently low in the body, in that space you frequently turn back to. White boys will always take it upon themselves to remove orange cones on their own impetus, thinking it all right to intimidate children into riding roller coasters when they don't really want to. I've always hated that. Body suggestions of perils to enjoy, levity at the cost of empathy. If you want anything from the body, if you fear anything of the body, then look first. See how action does not occur before the unconsciousness of action. What are you ruled by? Why do you still wear it? I gleaned whiteness in a snow globe, in the dressed-up corpses of trees spied through Christmas night windows, in a land where snow is ecologically impossible, especially in April. They played the song about white dreaming to let the non-people know it was time to go. And in response, we were the ones who sought to die, in our most ridiculous naive dreams, die intelligently enough to be permitted to crawl inside. But our innocent flush of living always gets in the way. Coming from so much death, how could we not know we are alive? Okay.
Thank you so much for being on Between the Covers.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're talking today to Dao Strom about her latest poetry collection from Ajar Press, You Will Always Be Someone from Somewhere Else. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. More of Dao Strom's work can be found at daostrom.com, diacritics.org, and dcanon, de-canon.com. Her memoir, We Were Meant to Be Gentle People, and her poetry collection, You Will Always Be From Somewhere Else, can be found at Small Press Distribution at spdbooks.org. And You Will Always Be From Somewhere Else can also be acquired directly from Ajar at ajarpress.com. Dao Strom will also be adding a live in-studio performance of her song Cataclysm to the bonus archive, and I'm uploading a conversation with translator Ly Thuy Nguyen about the experience of creating and working with the Vietnamese portion of the book. This joins readings by Carmen Maria Machado, Khi Nao, Therese Marie Myatt, Sheila Hetty, Forrest Gander, and others. All of this can be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, A Sapatita Me, can be found on iTunes. and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.